The morning I got banned from my own dock started like any other peaceful Saturday, except that by noon, a woman I barely knew was screaming that I was trespassing on property I owned, waving a clipboard around like it was some ancient scroll that gave her divine rights over the lake. Standing there with my fishing pole in one hand and my coffee in the other, I could only blink at her as my coffee went cold and my patience went colder. If you've never been publicly banned from your own dock by someone who didn't even own the shoreline, let me tell you, it's a special kind of absurdity that either breaks you or cracks you up. I chose to crack up quietly inside. It had started so simply. I had gotten up early, brewed a strong pot of coffee, and headed down the gravel path through the trees toward the dock my grandfather had built with his own 2 hands 50 years ago. The lake was glassy and still, a thin mist curling off the surface like steam from a tea kettle. My boots crunched on the damp earth as I breathed in the fresh scent of pine and water. Everything was right in the world, at least until I heard the sharp click of high heels behind me. I turned to see her marching down the path, a small woman with short, aggressively styled hair, a neon pink blazer, and a clipboard clutched like a weapon. Her name was Karen. I'd seen her at a few neighborhood meetings, always at the center of every argument, always claiming to represent the best interests of the homeowners association. I wasn't even part of the HOA. My property was grandfathered out. Technically, I was an island in their little kingdom, but that never seemed to stop them from trying to rope me into their nonsense. Karen didn't waste time. She planted herself squarely between me and the dock, brandishing the clipboard like a sheriff issuing a warrant. You are hereby notified that effective immediately, you are banned from accessing the dock and lakefront area until further notice, she announced, her voice echoing across the water. I blinked, looked at my dock, then back at her. You mean that dock? The one I built repairs on last summer with my own money? I asked, keeping my voice even. Karen puffed up like a balloon about to burst. That dock is part of the community common area, she snapped. HOA rules prohibit non-compliant individuals from using it. You haven't attended the last 3 meetings. You have unpaid dues. You are a violator. She said violator like it was a capital crime. I resisted the urge to laugh. Instead, I sipped my cold coffee and watched as a couple of other HOA members hovered behind her, nodding solemnly like disciples. It would have been funny if it wasn't so ridiculous. This was the dock my grandfather had dragged logs across ice to build. This was the dock I had repaired after the last winter storm ripped it halfway into the lake. This was the dock my father had taught me to fish from, where we spread his ashes after he passed. And now some woman with a clipboard was telling me I was banned because I didn't bow to their petty kingdom. I took the paper she shoved at me. It was a standard form filled in with my name and the word banned scrawled across the top in red marker. I folded it neatly and tucked it into my back pocket. Thank you, I said, nodding politely. Then I stepped around her, set my coffee on the dock, and cast my fishing line into the water as if she were nothing more than an overexcited seagull flapping her wings nearby. Karen gasped like she'd witnessed a felony. She stomped her heel hard enough that a small puff of dust kicked up. You're trespassing, she shrieked. I'm calling the authorities. Her voice climbed higher with every syllable until the birds in the trees scattered in a noisy panic. Go ahead, I said without looking back. The bass were biting, and I wasn't going to miss it because of her temper tantrum. She sputtered for a moment, then spun around and stormed up the hill, shouting back at her 2 silent companions to follow her. As they disappeared into the trees, I smiled to myself. I knew something Karen didn't. The shoreline, the dock, and a 10-foot perimeter around it were mine, deeded separately from the lots the HOA controlled. It was a fact as solid as the weathered boards beneath my boots. But I wasn't going to tell her that, not yet. Instead, I spent the next hour in blissful peace, casting and reeling, the sun climbing higher over the lake. When I finally wandered back up to the house, I found a bright orange notice pinned to my mailbox. Official HOA violation. Immediate action required. I plucked it free and tucked it under my arm with the ban notice, whistling a cheerful tune. Inside, I laid the papers on the kitchen table, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and pulled out the old leather folder my grandfather had kept locked away in his study. Inside were all the original deeds, maps, and correspondence related to the property. Everything I needed was there, written in careful script on brittle, yellowed paper. The shoreline belonged to me. The dock belonged to me. And not a single regulation or meeting or clipboard in the world could change that. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a slow, satisfied grin stretch across my face. Let her call the cops. Let her organize her little angry mob. Let her shout to the heavens. Because soon, very soon, Karen was going to find out that not only had she picked the wrong battle, but she'd also picked the wrong general. And I was just getting started. After Karen's dramatic attempt to ban me from my own dock, I knew it was time to prepare, not just to defend myself, but to completely dismantle her illusion of control. I started by spreading out all the old documents across my kitchen table. There was something almost ceremonial about it, like unrolling ancient scrolls before a battle. The folder was packed with brittle maps, faded deeds, and letters written long before Karen had even dreamed of moving to this lake. My grandfather had been meticulous, and now, years after his passing, his attention to detail was about to save me a world of headaches. I ran my fingers over the old county seal stamped at the bottom of the deed, the ink smudged but still legible. It spelled it out plainly in language that even Karen would have to understand, if it came to that. Full ownership of the shoreline, dock, and an adjoining strip of land extending 30 feet from the water's edge, independent from any homeowners association jurisdiction. I sipped my coffee and smiled to myself. There was power in paper, especially when the paper was older and stronger than any petty HOA regulation. Still, I knew that just having the deed wasn't enough. Karen wasn't the type to back down because someone told her she was wrong. She was the type to double down, triple down, drag everyone down with her if she could. I needed to make sure there were no cracks in my armor. I needed everything airtight. I decided to visit the county record's office to pull certified copies of the deeds and maps. Karen would undoubtedly question anything that came from me, but she couldn't argue with official government documents. On the way there, my mind wandered to the history of the dock, remembering summers spent with my grandfather, his weathered hands tying lines, the way he used to tell stories about the lake as if it were a living, breathing thing. This dock was more than wood and nails. It was a legacy. The clerk at the county office was a pleasant older man who took one look at my folder and gave a low whistle. "Looks like you've got everything you need," he said, "but let's get you fresh, certified copies just in case." It took about an hour, but I walked out of there with a fat envelope tucked under my arm, feeling like a man carrying the keys to a kingdom. Back home, I decided to dig a little deeper. Karen was treating the HOA like it was her personal fiefdom, and it made me wonder just how legitimate her authority really was. I spent the afternoon reading through public meeting minutes, bylaws, and public HOA filings. It turned out that not only was my property exempt, but several other houses nearby were too. Over the years, Karen and her inner circle had been conveniently ignoring that little detail, bullying exempt property owners into paying dues and following made-up rules by sheer force of intimidation and misinformation. The more I read, the clearer it became. Karen had built her power on sand, not stone, and it was only a matter of time before the tide rolled in. I laughed out loud as I discovered an email chain where Karen chastised a neighbor for repainting their mailbox without HOA approval, even though their property was never part of the HOA to begin with. There was a pattern here. She had gotten away with it because no one had pushed back. Until now. I spent the evening drafting a simple letter, citing the legal descriptions of my property, referencing the original deeds, and attaching copies of the county-certified documents. I kept the tone polite but firm. I made it clear that any further harassment would be met with legal action. I printed it on heavy cream-colored paper, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with a sense of finality. Tomorrow, I would deliver it personally to the HOA president, bypassing Karen entirely. Let her stew when she realized she wasn't even in the loop anymore. As night fell, I sat out on the porch overlooking the lake. The moon cast a silver sheen across the water, and the dock jutted out like a black silhouette. It looked peaceful. It was peaceful. For now. I knew the calm wouldn't last once Karen got wind of what I was doing. She wouldn't take it quietly. But I was ready. For the first time in days, I felt the tension lift from my shoulders. I wasn't just defending a dock. I was standing up for something bigger, something that had been entrusted to me. The next morning, I put on a clean shirt, grabbed the envelope, and walked over to the HOA president's house. It was a modest ranch-style place tucked a few streets back from the lake. Mr. Harrison, a mild-mannered retiree with a fondness for fishing and bad jokes, answered the door with a smile. I handed him the envelope and briefly explained the situation. His smile faltered a little as he listened, and when he took the envelope, he looked almost relieved. "I think it's about time someone stood up to Karen," he said in a low voice. "You're not the only one who's fed up." It was a small comment, but it planted a seed. Maybe I wasn't as alone in this as I'd thought. Maybe, just maybe, Karen had created more enemies than she realized. I thanked Mr. Harrison and turned back toward my house, feeling a growing sense of momentum. By mid-afternoon, I got confirmation that my letter had been logged officially into the HOA's records. It was a technicality, but an important one. Karen couldn't claim ignorance later. She would be forced to acknowledge the facts, whether she liked it or not. Later that day, as I was cleaning my fishing gear down by the dock, I noticed Karen standing up by the tree line, arms crossed, glaring daggers at me. She didn't step onto the dock this time. She just stood there, seething, her face flushing redder by the second. I gave her a polite little wave and went back to polishing my reel. If she wanted to make a scene, she'd have to come to me, and judging by the way she was practically vibrating with rage, it wouldn't be long before she did. As the sun dipped lower over the lake, I could almost feel the storm gathering behind those trees. Karen wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, but neither was I, and the next time she tried to come at me, she wouldn't just be facing one stubborn dock owner. She'd be facing a man armed with history, law, and a whole lot of neighbors who were just waiting for someone to lead the charge. The first sign that Karen wasn't going to back off quietly came 2 mornings later, when a county sheriff's cruiser pulled into my driveway, dust swirling around the tires. I had just finished my second cup of coffee and was about to head down to the dock for a little morning fishing when I spotted the flashing lights. For a second, my heart tightened in my chest, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because dealing with authorities, no matter how right you are, always carries a certain unease. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked out to meet the officer halfway. Deputy Thompson was a young man with a buzz cut and a polite but cautious expression. "Morning, sir," he said, adjusting his belt. "Got a call about a trespassing complaint. Says you're refusing to vacate HOA common property." I almost laughed right then and there, but managed to keep my face straight. "I see," I said calmly. "Well, you're welcome to take a look at my paperwork. I own the shoreline, the dock, and the strip of land leading to it. I have deeds certified by the county. You can verify it yourself if you like." The deputy shifted uncomfortably, obviously realizing this wasn't the simple open and shut case Karen had probably promised him it would be. I led him inside, offered him a seat at the kitchen table, and spread out the documents in front of him. He took his time reading through everything carefully. When he finally looked up, there was a faint trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Seems pretty clear to me," he said. "You're well within your rights. Sorry to bother you, sir. We have to respond when a complaint is filed, but it looks like this one is baseless." "No trouble at all," I said, genuinely meaning it. He tucked his notepad back into his pocket and shook my hand before heading back to his cruiser. As he pulled away, I spotted Karen peeking through the hedges a few houses down, her face twisted into a mask of frustration and disbelief. I gave her another little wave, just to twist the knife. That probably should have been the end of it, but with Karen, nothing was ever that simple. Later that week, flyers started appearing in mailboxes and on doorsteps. They were printed on bright yellow paper with bold black letters screaming, "Emergency HOA meeting at the lake dock to discuss unauthorized access and violations. Attendance mandatory." At first, I crumpled up the one stuffed into my mailbox and tossed it in the trash without a second thought. I wasn't a member. I wasn't under their jurisdiction. It had nothing to do with me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Karen was trying to rally the neighborhood against me, to smear my name and tighten her grip on whatever imaginary authority she thought she had. So I decided to attend, not as a participant, but as an observer. I would record everything quietly and legally, and have evidence in case this turned into something uglier down the road. When the day of the meeting came, I walked down to the dock with my phone discreetly recording audio from the front pocket of my shirt. Karen had set up a little podium at the foot of the dock, complete with a portable speaker and a clipboard brimming with papers. A handful of residents gathered around, looking confused and a little uncomfortable. Some cast glances my way when I arrived, half apologetic, half curious. Karen launched into her speech with the energy of a dictator rallying her troops. She talked about the importance of community standards, about protecting shared spaces, about rogue elements threatening their peaceful neighborhood. She never mentioned me by name, but every word dripped with thinly veiled accusations. She waved around copies of supposed violations and urged everyone to vote on measures to restrict access to the dock and lakefront, to impose fines and penalties, to strengthen enforcement powers. I leaned casually against a tree at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, listening to every word. When she finished her fiery sermon, I cleared my throat just loud enough to draw attention. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my tone light. "I just have a quick question." Karen stiffened like she'd been electrocuted. She narrowed her eyes at me, the microphone trembling slightly in her hand. "Is it legal to impose rules and fines on property you don't own or control?" I asked. "Especially when county records show it's private land, not HOA common area?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen stammered, tried to recover, but the damage was done. I saw heads turning, people whispering. One of the older neighbors, Mr. Peterson, spoke up. "I thought his land was grandfathered out. Never joined the HOA, right?" Another voice chimed in. "If he owns the dock, what are we even doing here?" Karen's face turned a shade of purple I'd never seen before. She tried to rally, accusing me of being disruptive, but by then it was too late. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was growing fast. I watched as the gathering slowly disintegrated into confusion and quiet dissent, neighbors drifting away, murmuring among themselves. Before leaving, I made sure to walk right past Karen, meeting her furious glare with a calm smile. "Lovely meeting," I said cheerfully. "Very informative." I could feel her vibrating with rage as I strolled away, my phone still recording every second of her meltdown. That night, I replayed the recording and chuckled to myself. I had everything I needed: proof of her false claims, proof of her attempts to enforce illegal rules, proof that I was being harassed for exercising my legal rights. I saved multiple copies of the file, uploaded them to the cloud, and sent one to my attorney, just for good measure. The storm wasn't over yet. Karen was wounded, cornered, and desperate. That made her dangerous. But now I was ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about a dock anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who thought she could control everyone with fear and paperwork. She had tried to turn the neighborhood against me. Instead, she had turned herself into the villain, and soon enough, everyone would see it as clearly as I did. The following week felt like the quiet before a storm, the kind of tense silence that makes you instinctively check the sky even when there isn't a cloud in sight. Karen was plotting something. I could feel it. She wasn't the type to accept defeat, not even when the truth was staring her in the face. Sure enough, the next blow came not through shouting or public spectacle, but through a certified letter slid into my mailbox without so much as a knock at the door. I opened it at the kitchen table, scanning the thick legal language until I found the heart of it. The HOA, through Karen's insistence, was issuing a formal notice demanding I cease all use of the dock immediately, claiming that my continued presence constituted a violation of neighborhood standards and posed a threat to community harmony. I laughed out loud. It was almost impressive how she could dress up her nonsense in official-sounding jargon. She must have spent hours crafting that letter. I set it down beside my coffee mug, opened my laptop, and began crafting my response. It was time to turn the tables, not with anger or pettiness, but with cold, hard facts that not even Karen could twist. I wrote a cease and desist letter of my own, citing the harassment, the false claims, the clear evidence of my ownership, and the multiple attempts to restrict my lawful use of my property. I attached certified copies of the deed, photographs of the dock repairs I had personally funded, and a copy of the recorded HOA meeting where Karen had lied publicly. I delivered the letter to the HOA office in person, handing it directly to Mr. Harrison, who accepted it with a grim nod. His tired eyes told me he knew exactly what Karen had been up to and was no longer willing to cover for her. By that afternoon, a notice went out to all HOA members announcing an emergency board meeting to address a potential legal liability. Karen must have realized that things were slipping from her control, because 2 days later, the local news van showed up at the lake. I was down at the dock fixing a loose board when I noticed the van pulling up and the reporter stepping out, microphone in hand, cameraman in tow. Karen was right behind them, practically shoving the poor reporter toward me like a pushy stage mom forcing a child into the spotlight. The reporter approached me, offering a professional but curious smile. "We're covering a story about disputes between homeowners and the HOA," she said. "Would you mind giving a comment?" I stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and gave her a nod. "Sure," I said, happy to set the record straight. The camera rolled as I calmly explained the situation. I showed her the certified deed, the original maps, the letters from the county, and even played a short clip from the recording of Karen's meeting. I kept my tone polite and factual, never once raising my voice or speaking badly about anyone by name. I let the facts do the talking. Meanwhile, Karen paced in the background, barking corrections and interruptions at the reporter, who was trying very hard to ignore her. Finally, in a move that sealed her own fate, Karen grabbed the microphone mid-interview and started ranting about how people like me were ruining the community, how rules were rules, how she had the right to enforce them even when they didn't technically apply. The reporter, sensing gold, let her talk. She nodded sympathetically, asked leading questions, and captured every incriminating word. The segment aired that night. It wasn't flattering. The story painted Karen as a power-hungry busybody overstepping her bounds, while I came across as the calm, reasonable landowner standing up for my rights. Neighbors who had been too intimidated to speak out before suddenly found their voices. My phone rang constantly the next morning with calls and texts from people thanking me for standing up to her. Some apologized for not doing so sooner. I decided it was time to take the victory a step further. I hired a contractor to expand the dock, adding a small pavilion with a bench and a sunshade. It was still well within the legal boundaries of my land, but it sent a clear message. This was my space, my family's legacy, and I would protect it. I also installed a series of discreet but unmistakable signs around the shoreline. Private property, no trespassing, not HOA property. I made sure they were worded politely but firmly, and I posted copies of my certified deed next to them in weatherproof cases so that anyone curious could see for themselves. The day the contractors arrived to begin work, Karen showed up in a fury, storming down the path toward the dock with a group of her few remaining loyalists trailing behind her like angry ducklings. "You can't do this," she screamed. "This is an abuse of power. You're ruining the community." I stayed calm, motioning toward the posted deed copies. "Everything I'm doing is legal," I said. "You're trespassing now. Please leave." Her face turned a deep shade of red, and she opened her mouth to argue. But before she could, flashing lights appeared once again. This time, it wasn't just a single sheriff's deputy. It was 2 cruisers. One of the deputies walked up to Karen, calm but firm. "Ma'am, you've been informed previously that this property is private and not subject to HOA rules. Continued harassment or trespassing will result in arrest." Karen screamed about her rights, about injustice, about how she would sue everyone in sight, but the deputies were unmoved. When she refused to leave, they put her in handcuffs and gently but firmly led her to the cruiser. The neighborhood watched from their porches and windows as Karen, queen of the HOA, was driven away in the backseat of a sheriff's car. As the contractors finished the day's work, several neighbors wandered down to the dock, cautious at first but growing bolder when they saw me smiling and waving them over. They admired the new pavilion, asked about fishing spots, reminisced about the old days when the lake was just a peaceful place to enjoy without a mountain of regulations. Slowly, the sense of community that Karen had tried to strangle with red tape and threats began to come back to life. I sat on the new bench that evening, watching the sun dip low over the water, feeling a peace that had been missing for far too long. Karen's reign of terror was over, not through shouting or fighting, but through patience, persistence, and the quiet strength of standing up for what was right. And I had a feeling the best part was still to come. The sun rose slow and golden over the lake the next morning, casting a smooth shimmer across the water that looked almost too perfect to be real. I sat on the dock with my coffee balanced on the railing of the newly built pavilion, feeling a kind of satisfaction that words couldn't quite capture. The storm had passed. Karen was gone, at least for now, facing charges for trespassing and harassment. The dock was mine again, fully and undeniably. But I knew better than to think it was truly over. People like Karen didn't surrender easily. They retreated, regrouped, and looked for sneaky ways to claw their way back. I was ready for it. What I wasn't ready for was just how desperate and absurd her next move would be. It started small. A few nights later, I noticed muddy footprints on the dock, small and deliberate, like someone had crept down there after dark. Nothing was stolen or damaged, but the message was clear. Someone had been snooping around, and it didn't take a genius to guess who. I checked the security cameras I'd quietly installed facing the dock, and sure enough, there she was, Karen, dressed in dark clothing, tiptoeing around with a flashlight, peering at the new signs and snapping pictures with her phone. I sat back in my chair, shaking my head and chuckling under my breath. It would have been sad if it weren't so pathetic. Rather than confront her directly, I decided to make it even harder for her. I installed additional motion sensor lights and signs around the property. I also upgraded the camera system so that any movement near the dock at night would immediately send footage to both my phone and a secure cloud account. If Karen wanted to play sneaky games, she'd find herself starring in her very own late-night reality show, recorded in full-color high definition. Still, it seemed Karen had one last scheme up her sleeve. One crisp morning, just as the mist was lifting off the water, I found an official-looking document taped to the front door of my house. It was a notice claiming that my dock structure violated environmental regulations and would need to be dismantled immediately. It even had a fake county seal on it. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. This time, Karen had crossed from petty harassment into felony territory. Forging government documents was no small thing. I took the notice straight to the sheriff's department. Deputy Thompson was there again, and when he saw the paper, his eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. "We'll take it from here," he said, his voice grim. I could tell he meant it. Karen was about to find out that there were real consequences for her little games. That evening, as the sky turned purple and orange with the setting sun, a group of deputies showed up at Karen's house with a warrant. Word traveled fast around the neighborhood. People stepped out onto their porches and watched as Karen, red-faced and sputtering, was led away in handcuffs for the second time in as many weeks. This time, it wasn't just trespassing. It was forgery, fraud, and tampering with official documents. Even the most loyal of her few remaining followers turned their backs, pretending they'd never supported her at all. With Karen finally removed from the equation, real change started happening fast. The HOA board called an emergency election to replace the leadership, and for the first time in years, there was genuine excitement among the homeowners. People who had kept their heads down, afraid of retaliation, now spoke freely. I was even asked to attend the meetings as an honored guest, though I politely declined official involvement. I'd fought my battle. It was time for others to carry the torch. Mr. Harrison, newly elected as the interim HOA president, came by my house one afternoon with a simple gesture of goodwill. A handwritten note of apology from the board acknowledging that my property was independent, and a gift basket filled with local goods. It was a small thing, but it meant a lot. It signaled the end of the hostility and the beginning of something better. Meanwhile, I finished the dock upgrades I'd dreamed about for years. I added a few benches, planted some wildflowers along the shoreline, and built a small fire pit at the edge of the dock where friends and family could gather on cool nights. I had neighbors stop by just to say hello, to bring homemade pies, or just to sit and swap stories while watching the sunset. The lake, once a place of tension and silent feuds, became once again a place of peace, laughter, and community. One evening, as a cool breeze rippled across the water and the stars blinked to life in the darkening sky, I sat by the fire pit with a few old friends. We roasted marshmallows, passed around mugs of hot cider, and laughed about the absurdity of everything that had happened. Someone joked about erecting a little wooden statue of Karen at the end of the dock, forever commemorating her downfall. We laughed so hard it felt like years of stress were being washed away in one big tide of relief. Later that night, long after the others had gone home, I stayed behind alone by the fire. The lake was silent except for the occasional splash of a fish jumping. I thought about my grandfather and how proud he would have been. He had built this dock as a place for family and friends to gather, not as a battleground. I picked up a small, smooth stone from the shore, turned it over in my hand, and threw it out into the dark water, watching it disappear with a soft plunk. This was more than a victory over Karen. It was a victory for what the lake meant to all of us: freedom, family, peace. And no one, no clipboard-waving tyrant, could ever take that away again. I stood up, stretched, and made my way back up the path to the house, the fire dying down behind me, a soft glow in the darkness. The dock stood strong against the water, just as it always had, and just as it always would. The days rolled on quietly after everything settled, the kind of quiet that sinks into your bones and makes you realize how much noise you'd been living with before without even noticing. There were no more angry notices shoved into my mailbox, no more suspicious footprints by the dock, no more sudden outbursts from across the trees. Karen had become a ghost story, told in hushed voices around fire pits and late evening porch gatherings. A cautionary tale about what happens when someone tries to rule over people who have no intention of being ruled. For the first time in a long time, life on the lake returned to the rhythm it was always meant to have. Each morning, I woke up to the soft rustle of the wind through the trees and the gentle lapping of water against the dock. I would take my coffee down to the pavilion, sit on the bench, and watch the mist lift off the lake like a curtain opening on a stage. It was a small ritual, but it meant more to me than I could explain to anyone. It was a promise kept, not just to myself, but to the memory of those who had come before me, who had loved this place long before I was even born. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now stopped by regularly. Sometimes it was just to share a friendly wave from across the shore. Sometimes it was to join me for a quiet chat by the water. One afternoon, old Mr. Peterson brought down a photo album filled with pictures of the lake from decades ago, long before the neighborhood had even been developed. We sat for hours, flipping through the brittle pages, laughing at the ridiculous haircuts and outdated swimsuits, marveling at how much had changed and how much, somehow, had stayed exactly the same. It became clear over time that many of the neighbors had never wanted the kind of rigid control Karen had tried to impose. They had gone along with it out of fear or habit, not out of real belief. With her gone, a new kind of energy took root. People painted their houses the colors they wanted, built gardens bursting with color without worrying about violation notices, organized community cookouts without needing to file 3 forms and beg for permission. It was a kind of rebirth, and it was beautiful to watch. One evening, as the sun sank low and turned the lake into a sheet of molten gold, I received a letter that brought everything full circle. It was from the new HOA board, now under Mr. Harrison's leadership. They wanted to officially amend their records to acknowledge the exempt properties like mine, making it clear to everyone going forward that there would be no more confusion, no more harassment, no more overreach. They included a formal apology signed by every board member and a personal note from Mr. Harrison thanking me for standing my ground when so many others had felt powerless to do so. I sat on the porch holding that letter, feeling a mix of pride and a strange, quiet sadness. It should never have come to this. People shouldn't have to fight so hard just to be left alone. But sometimes that's the way of things. Sometimes standing up for yourself isn't just about you. Sometimes it's about showing others that they can stand up too. Later that night, I found myself digging through an old chest in the attic, the one that had belonged to my grandfather. Buried under layers of dusty quilts and yellowed newspaper clippings, I found a bundle of letters tied together with twine. They were letters he had written but never sent, little notes about life on the lake, reflections about the world changing around him, hopes for the future. I sat there for a long time, reading his words by the light of a single bulb, feeling like he was right there with me. One letter in particular caught my eye. In it, he wrote about the dock, about how it wasn't just a place to fish or swim or tie up a boat. It was a gathering place, a bridge between generations, a small piece of something bigger than any one person. He wrote about hoping that whoever came after him would love it enough to fight for it if they ever needed to. I folded that letter carefully and brought it downstairs, placing it in a small wooden frame. It now hangs by the back door, a quiet reminder of where it all started and why it mattered. Summer deepened, and the lake became a hive of joyful noise again. Children laughed as they splashed in the shallows. Teenagers raced their kayaks across the water. Families gathered for impromptu picnics under the pavilion. Evenings were filled with the scent of barbecue smoke and the sounds of guitars strumming under the stars. I often found myself sitting back and just watching it all, soaking in the life and laughter that had returned to this place. Every once in a while, someone would bring up Karen, usually with a shake of the head and a laugh about how crazy things had gotten. But more often, the conversation would shift quickly to better things, to future plans and shared memories and small victories. In a way, her story faded into the background, not erased but transformed into something almost useful. A reminder of what happens when fear wins and how much sweeter life can be when it doesn't. One night after a long day spent fishing and laughing with friends, I sat at the very end of the dock, feet dangling over the edge, staring up at a sky so clear it seemed like you could reach out and touch the stars. I thought about everything that had happened, every confrontation, every sleepless night, every small moment of doubt, and I realized something simple and profound. Sometimes you win not by shouting the loudest or fighting the hardest, but by simply refusing to give up what you know is rightfully yours. I picked up a smooth stone from the dock, kissed it for luck the way my grandfather used to do, and tossed it out into the water. It made a soft splash, barely a ripple in the vast, peaceful lake. And as I sat there watching the stars and feeling the cool breeze against my face, I knew that no matter what the future held, this place, this life, would always be mine to protect, to cherish, and to pass on to whoever came next. The dock stood strong against the night, just as it always had.